One thing I've appreciated about the summer in Tucson is monsoon season. And one of the things I appreciate about it is that the storms here do remind me a bit of the storms of childhood in the upper Midwest. I've lived in parts of the country, there's some lightning, thunder, but nothing that really makes you go, whoa. And here, you sometimes go, whoa. Now, as a young child growing up there in the upper Midwest, I was afraid of the storms. I was afraid. And I think often young children are, but I was also one of those young children that started paying attention to things at an early age, and I was aware that storms flooded and tornadoes destroyed and all those kinds of things. So I had already, from a pretty early age, had this association. But I also remember how we sort of yearned for storms at some point because the heat would start to build. There would be this release of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, they would tell us, which seems so far away from Michigan, where I was, and yet it would be pumped up, and it would get more and more humid. And this was in an era and in a part of the country when almost no one had air conditioning in their homes or their cars. And so I remember the adults saying, oh, I can't wait for this heat to break. But there's really only one way for it to break, and it was usually a storm. And the meteorologists would tell us about a cold front coming, and that cold front would hit that warm, moist air, and the clouds would start to thicken, and the wind would kick up, and there would be little watches and warnings flashing across the bottom of the television screen. You could start to hear the rumbles of thunder, and it meant bring the lawn chairs in. And as it seemed inevitable to my young self, I remember my response and my fear to the storms were the typical fight and flee. So my fighting was with my little imagination where I wished the storm would go away. And sometimes I had heard adults say that the storm blew over. So whatever that was, I wanted that to happen. Just go on by. Well, I did not hold that kind of power. And so the storms would come. And so then my next response was to try to hide, to flee the storm as best I could. And I remember especially at night, as the lightning would flash and the thunder would rumble and you'd hear the wind hitting the house and the branches sometimes knocking against it. And I remember even though it was so hot and humid, I would pull the blanket over my head trying to block out the lightning and put a pillow over my ears so I wouldn't have to hear the thunder. And then the storm would clear. And what I would notice is it sure was better after the storm. The air was more breathable. The sky was bluer. Everything felt washed clean. It was like the world had been made new. And I wonder if something of those kinds of experiences are in view in all these biblical stories about storms. But not just storms, of course, in terms of meteorological events, but the metaphor of storms. Because life is stormy, is it not? Storms arise. Storms just come. It's part of how it works. Sometimes you're trying to finish your laundry, getting ready to travel, to go to Michigan to see your family, and it's your last Sunday where you're preaching, and then the air conditioning stops working. Hypothetically, no. Sometimes there's storms in our bodies. Something's invading, and the white blood cells kick in, and the immune system's responding, and there's this battle within us. Sometimes there's storms in our local communities. People sometimes just rude, cutting each other off, or school board meetings. Anyone watched any local school board meetings recently? Like, just craziness going on, often funded by national organizations to make sure that kids don't read certain books, for example. And then we have storms, of course, at the national level. The media just puts us in red state, blue state, like some weird Dr. Seuss book. And we see in Congress just complete gridlock, name-calling. You got false eyelashes. Well, you're a bleach blonde. The people elected to national office do this stuff. They're storms. And that can be scary. And then, of course, internationally and around the world, there's always the storms of war somewhere. Hamas attacking Israeli citizens. Horrible. And then the Israeli government fighting back, but in a way that is looking like genocide in Gaza. Horrible, horrible stuff. Storms roaring. What do we do in the storms? What happens in the storms? What do we do with the storms? So we have a story today in the gospel where you heard a storm comes up. And first, I want to point out that the intro to the story is Jesus with his disciples in a boat. And there's still a storm. Jesus is with them, and there is still a storm. Sometimes there can be this idea, maybe some of us were taught, that what God's business is to protect you from ever experiencing a storm. And if things got stormy, you must not be believing enough or doing it right. But here's a story, Jesus in the boat with them, and there's a storm. And I remember last year in the theology on prayer class that we were teaching on Sundays, the inevitable questions about praying and why do bad things happen to good people. And I remember digging into some of the gospel stories, trying to find out, is there any time that Jesus kept a bad thing from ever happening? Did Jesus keep people from storms? And what we kept seeing again and again is plenty of stories where there's healing, there's renewal, there's new life on the other side, but the storms come. The storms even hit Jesus. So there's this idea that storms are part of the fabric of the universe. Just like we have storms in our weather. They just come. Well, in life, the storms come. So then what do we do? Well, in the story, did you see what Jesus was doing as the storm hit? Anyone catch that? Sleeping. Sleeping. Little childhood Michael wished he could have done that in the storm. So what's going on with that? Jesus asleep as the boat, and this is not some giant cruise ship. Right? The waves are tossing things about. So Jesus, asleep in the storm, perhaps what's in view, there's another psalm that talks about God giving sleep to those who trust that they are God's beloved. And perhaps there's a symbol or an idea that Jesus, in his practice of life, entrusts himself to God and therefore even has peace or centeredness when there's a storm. So there's a storm all around him, but he's still at rest or at peace. That's an interesting possibility. The disciples are showing us the other possibility, perhaps more frequently experienced, where the storm's around us and the storm gets into us. So the disciples not just see a storm, but you see they're agitated, they're distressed, they're upset. Doesn't that happen? The storms around us of life, they get in us, and we can become stormy. Does that ever happen for you? Ever become stormy based on the storms around you? There's research I was reading a few years ago that, and it doesn't matter which channel, but people who watch a lot of cable news are more often upset and distressed because there's the constant, the whole thing is about keeping us upset and stay tuned, breaking news, right? Keep us hooked. But then we're taking in the storms all around the world all the time, 24/7. And of course, that was even before we could have it in our phones. Go with you everywhere. Need a storm? Scroll. So the storms get in us, and the storms get in these disciples, these followers of Jesus. So what do they do in the storm? So the storm's now in them. What can you do about that? And there's another story where they engage in that story, the more typical fight or flight. It says the storm was coming, and the disciples in a boat were straining at the oars. They're trying to fight the storm. They're trying to outrow it, outpaddle it, work against it. I once was caught in a kayak in a windstorm. That does not work. But we got to learn. So in this story, though, to their credit, they do not fight or flee. And what they do instead is cry out. They cry out in the storm. And I think about different ways to understand the idea of crying out. Think about literally crying. What happens when we're crying? Well, we're expelling words, tears, right? There's wind and water, so to speak, coming out of us. Well, if we think about in the story, the storm is wind and water. So the wind and water of the storm got in them, and now the crying out, the wind and water releasing, going out. So maybe that's an initial step to be ready in the storm. How do you let go of that? Once the storm's in you, what do? Maybe cry out, cry, scream, let the feelings be felt. But they don't just cry out in general, they cry out for help. They recognize they can't do the storm on their own. And so, Jesus, do you not care that we are perishing? So it's a bit of a snarky cry for help, but it's still a cry for help. And there's this recognition and understanding, and perhaps they're learning in their journey, is that in asking Jesus for help, and he's been embodying God's presence, that God is the God who creates out of the chaos, who can help us know peace and wholeness and strength even in the midst of the storms. They see it already in Jesus. And then there's this idea of that peace could be contagious. So Jesus gets up and he says to the storm, "Peace, be still." And the idea for me is that Jesus is taking the stormy energy and it's being channeled in a different direction. So instead of the storm taken in and making the people stormy, the storm, it's a creative channeling of the energy. And we've seen that about God's power doing that from the very beginning. In the creation story, it says God's spirit or breath moves over the waters of the deep. And that's the whole beginning of creation. Or the Israelites on the choppy waters of the Red Sea at the shore, and here comes the Egyptians. That's storm, 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 storm. What are they going to do in the squish place? They cry out for help, and God makes a way through the sea. God makes a way through the storm, channels the energy of the chaos in a way that takes them from slavery to freedom, from chaos to new creation. And then Jesus asks his disciples, "Why are you afraid, O you of little trust?" And this could be easy to miss. I don't think, when Jesus asks that question, he's not shaming people. Jesus doesn't seem to be a shaming person. And sometimes we read that way because other people sometimes have shamed us, so it's easy to project that into the language of Jesus. But over and over again in the biblical stories, whenever someone who's representing divine energy or spirit or presence encounters humans, often one of the first things out of their mouths is, "Don't be afraid." And sometimes, if we just, on the surface, like, well, that is not helpful. Right? How many times in the history of being afraid, someone telling you, "Don't be afraid," makes you not afraid? But, and this may be nitpicking a little bit, but I notice that the angels, that Jesus doesn't say, "Don't feel afraid." Because fear is a feeling. We can't manage or control that fear rises in us. But the language of being afraid, there's this idea for me of, well, don't live into the fear. Don't become the fear. Don't lean into the fear. There's this recognition that even as fear rises, there's choice in the fear. We do not have to be the fear. That instead, what we could do is cry out, ask for help, open to that power that creates out of the chaos, for example. And he's also then reminding them that what they've seen in him can be part of what they're up to as well. But like so often in the stories, they miss it first go round. They're like, who is this? That even he has the peace in the storm. But what Jesus is already teaching them is they can choose that. They can be that in themselves and for other people as well. I was remembering 5 years ago when this congregation voted to call me as your settled senior minister. And then around this time of year, 5 years ago, I came back to Tucson to try to find somewhere to live. Apparently with a wonky air conditioner. But I found a place eventually. But while I was looking for rental properties around, I was hearing on the radio the word haboob. What's that? Something happened on the I-10, haboob. And I was hearing monsoon, and I'd heard of monsoon, but I thought it was something like from Gilligan's Island. And then I saw darkness over the mountains that I now know are the Rincons. They were just some other mountains at the time. And I wondered, is it going to rain? Now, I was from a place at that time in the mid-Atlantic where it's practically now a tropical rainforest. I mean, there's plenty of moisture there, but it's been on the increase the last 5-10 years. So rain, not a big deal. Like, it's going to rain. Nice. So as I was, though, in the midst of the house hunting, I stopped to get some food at a Thai restaurant on Speedway. And I went in. It was around 5, 6 o'clock. And there were other people in the restaurant. And while I was in there had been sun shining on us, but the sky grew dark, and the sun was cut off. And what I noticed, to me, I was like, all right, But the people were like, there was this like buzz in the restaurant. And I heard someone say it hadn't rained yet. It hadn't rained yet. We're hoping it will rain. And then there was this flash and this thunder that shook the place. I go, oh. And the first fat drops of rain were hitting the parking lot. And I thought, oh, nice. And then the fat drops became frequent, and it was pouring like something just let loose. And then the thing that stunned me wasn't that it was raining. That seemed normal to me, is that people got out of their seats in the restaurant and ran outside and looked up to the sky. And I thought, well, this is a different relationship with a storm. But I remember reflecting, I wasn't afraid of storms anymore, but thinking about my childhood self, trying to fight and flee storms. Here was a people who were embracing them, who were seeing the gifts in the storm. And I wondered about that. And then I think it's helpful that I experienced that, because I will confess that in the 5 years I've been here, I have encountered more storms than usual in the metaphoric sense. And some of them we've shared. Pandemics, mountains on fire, political chaos, all of that. But I remember it first started happening a few months in. I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and it was low level, and what they do is called active surveillance with that kind of cancer. But what I knew already then is I have essentially a life sentence. They will test me every 6 months, biopsies every 2 years, and the best news I will ever get is, you still have cancer. And the only way out is for it to get worse. And some of you know it has more recently. But that was happening. I'm here by myself. I really don't know people. And I'm hearing on the news that there's a pandemic, and it's breaking out. And things are happening in China, and then there's people filling emergency rooms in Europe. And so it's coming. There's a storm coming of this pandemic. But I also remember this feeling like, are there no adults in charge? Because this pandemic was becoming politicized. And I remember having these memories of like my grandparents when global trouble happened. My grandparents, World War II, Great Depression, everyone pulled together. We will work together. We will deal with this storm together. And I was part of an America where it's like everyone for themselves. And shaming and scolding and just more fear. And I had this feeling inside me like childhood self, like that particular storm, I would like to wish it away. I wanted to believe that it will be gone by Easter like magic, we were told. It wasn't. I wanted that to be true, I really did, but I didn't think it would be. And there was no way for me to fight it. It was big. So what do? I'm alone. We're going to have to lock down things. I'm with a congregation I really don't know very well. Working with a staff team who's been through lots of pastors, and they're amazing, but they're learning to trust me. Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? But there was a lot of prayer and listening. And there was asking for help. There was relying on this staff team. We had a pandemic response team made up of members of the church to help us make decisions, because you know what they don't teach you in seminary? How to keep people from dying in a pandemic. We're asking each other for help. And the staff team in this church blew me away, because we went from an in-person worship service to, all right, that's the last one for a while, to the next Sunday on a web page with something that looked like our worship bulletin, where people could click on each thing to open up the different components of worship. We needed something user-friendly. Most people weren't using technology in the congregation. So how do we have an accessible worship service and recording little segments and this working together? And then infrastructure placed in, now we have live streaming, but that wasn't in place at the time. And we shifted to Zoom with Bible studies and centering prayer and meetings. And we didn't just keep it going, but there were people who were like, this is a lifeline for me. I am alone in my house. I am widowed. And I am scared, but I still can worship with my church. I can still connect after the worship service with our Zoom coffee hour. None of it was ideal, but we did it together. Prayer and creativity, even in the midst of this horrific storm. And we're still using some of the gifts that came from that storm. I don't like that storm happened. But I love the ways that we learned more clearly that we are not confined to walls. that the body of Christ lives in the world. And that just because, say, someone's a snowbird and spends half the year in Wisconsin or New England, we can all still be in on it together and learn together and grow together and share together. So I just wanted to share that gift for me of what happened in listening and prayer in the midst of the storm, crying out for help, and there was crying out, and working together with lay leaders and staff members, and this beautiful creativity that was and is still in ways life-giving. So storms are coming. Storms are here. Talking metaphor now. There's a 40% chance later today, literal. So what do we do in the storms? We're reminded there can be practices that help us, that maybe certain storms come and we're already centered and grounded. We're like Jesus, at rest, okay, ready to help other people. Other times, the storms get in us and we're agitated and distressed and maybe sometimes snarky. But we can cry out. We can feel what needs feeling. We can ask for help of God and each other. And there is creativity in the storms. There is new life. The world can be made new, one storm at a time. Jesus shows us the way. Come and see. Amen.